Quorum Radio, baby. We're on right now Quorum Radio with Mark Shaw, author of a New York Times bestselling book, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. Unless you wonder who that reporter is, it's a famous woman from the 1960s, Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a media star, a journalistic superstar in the 50s and 60s in the United States, and who met her end not too long after she began to investigate the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So, exactly. So, Mark, let me give you people a little bit of an idea who you are, your status, your stature. You're a California attorney, you're a TV commentator, and also, as said, a New York Times bestselling author and investigator. Mark Shaw has written about.
Thanks. It sounds like I can't hold a job. So many different jobs. Fascinating life, Bill, and so many blessings for sure. Yes, I've written now nearly 30 books. I never had any idea that would happen.
Oh my gosh!
I've never written anything before.
It's astonishing.
I kind of fell into that. I'm a former criminal defense lawyer in the Midwest, handled mostly murder cases, first as a public defender and then as an attorney. And I finally decided that that life wasn't for me. It just so much. It's very difficult to be in that environment when you're dealing with so much violence and all of that. And so, I left that, moved to Colorado, then got into the television area as a correspondent for Good Morning America, and covered trials for them and interviews and different things with all of that, and ended up on a CBS show. And from that point, I matriculated out to California and got my license out here. I don't practice law anymore. Mostly I've just become an investigative reporter looking into different types of cases. I did cover the Kobe Bryant and O.J. Simpson and Mike Tyson's trial. And when I was covering the Tyson trial, that became my first book, because I was working for USA Today and CNN and ABC on that trial. And I was just absolutely upset with the defense that Mike Tyson had. There wasn't that much evidence against him. And so I wrote a book about that, my first one, called Down for the Count. And I was actually looking at that book the other day, and it wasn't too bad a book. So I feel good about it. But just one book then led to another and led to another and led to another. And, I finally, I really had, to get into our subject, I really had no real interest in the JFK assassination until about 2007. I knew about the assassination, of course. I grew up. I remember when it was and everything. But I had practiced law in the 1980s with a man that many of your listeners or viewers may remember. His name was Melvin Belli. And
Sure.
He was a famous lawyer in San Francisco, not too far from where I live now. And I knew him in the 80s. I practiced law then and was in the building he was in down in the middle of San Francisco. And when I was always fascinated with Belli. He represented Muhammad Ali and the Rolling Stones and Tammy Faye Baker and Errol Flynn and all of those celebrities. He was a tort lawyer, though. Mostly he was a civil lawyer who sued big companies for personal injury and stuff like that. But anyway, when he died in 1996, I thought about writing a biography of him. And so I began to do so, and as I did, I started learning more about Belli, not only about his cases, Bill, but also the fact that his most famous client was Jack Ruby, who shot, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald, just following the death of John Kennedy. And so I started looking into some things with Belli, and two particular clues came to me. Now, like you, I'm a very curious person. I like to look into things and try to find out what the truth is. That's always been part of my makeup. So I was talking, first of all, to a doctor in San Diego who knew Belli. And we were talking about Belli and so on and so forth. And he said, he knew a woman named Dorothy Kilgallen. And I said, well, just like your listeners, I said, he was on the CBS program, What's My Line, which was an intellectual quiz show in the 1960s,
Sure.
50s and 60s
Bennett
on
Cerf.
CBS. every Sunday night at 10:30 live from New York. And who were the panelists, Bill? Do you remember?
Bennett Cerf, Dorothy was on, and
Right.
the other people I don't remember. I just remember it was a very erudite show.
It was. It was. The other two are, one was Arlene Francis, the
Arlene
actress.
Francis, yeah.
Right. They
Sure.
had a celebrity panelist as well, Tony Randall, and
Kitty
some other
Carlisle.
people.
Was it Kitty Carlisle?
No, she actually replaced Dorothy when unfortunately Dorothy died in
Oh,
1965.
yeah.
John Daly was the host. And so
Right.
I said to this man, this doctor in San Diego, well, was Belli on the show? He said, no, Mark, you don't know anything about Dorothy Kilgallen. Yes, she was on What's My Line, but more than that, she was this investigative reporter who covered many of the main trials of the 20th century. Dr. Sam Shepard, which became the Fugitive film with Harrison Ford, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, all of these different cases. She also had a radio program that was listened to by 1 million people every day, and she was syndicated to 200 newspapers across the country with a column she had. And he said, in fact, maybe you want to know, maybe you don't know, she covered the Jack Ruby trial. Well, that hit me because I knew finally that Belli was Ruby's lawyer and all of that. And then there was a second clue because I found a gentleman who knew Belli, and at the very time that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, they were having lunch down at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. A waiter came up and said, well, you're not going to believe this. Jack Ruby just blew away Lee Harvey Oswald. And according to this guy, Belli said, well, now I'll have to represent Jack Ruby. So those two clues made me wonder, and that led me to realizing and finding out that one of Melvin Belli's main clients was Mickey Cohen, who was a Los Angeles gangster of a dangerous man, according to FBI files. And Belli and he were very good friends, and it got me started to thinking about Belli's affiliation with the mafia. A couple of his lawyer friends said he loved the mafia. They loved him. He liked to hang out with them in Las Vegas. And what happened then, as I think it would have happened to you, is that I started wondering about his representation of Jack Ruby, because he was a tort lawyer. He wasn't a criminal defense lawyer. There were many better qualified lawyers in the country to represent Ruby, and yet Belli was chosen. And when I went to look at the trial, there were two things that came out. Number one, he wouldn't let Ruby testify. And number two, he pled him insane. He pleaded him not guilty by insanity, a psychomotor epilepsy insanity defense, which made no sense to me. And so I started looking into that, and I wondered if there could be the connection between Belli, Ruby, Oswald, and perhaps those people who orchestrated the JFK assassination. And I can explain to you then how I backtracked from that point of view that led me then to learning more about Dorothy Kilgallen.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Tell us about that, the connection. Yeah. It's fascinating.
Well,
and by the way, quick question, Mark, I want to ask you. When did Dorothy start digging into the case? Was it just right after the assassination of JFK, or a year later, or when?
Let me lead up to that, if I may. Let's go back, because I'm going to tell your listeners right now, I've been amazed through Dorothy Kilgallen's eyes and her research and everything else. The people have called me now the foremost expert on the JFK assassination, and I probably am, because Dorothy was the expert, and I've been guided by her in terms of my investigation. There are now more than 2 million views of my presentations and interviews up on YouTube. If people Google me and Dorothy Kilgallen and JFK and the Allen Library in Texas, where I gave a presentation in November, if you Google that, that video alone has almost 1 million views. And the reason is because of Dorothy Kilgallen. But I had to find her by going back. I wrote the Belli book, Melvin Belli, King of the Courtroom, published in 2007. I then went back and looked at the 1960 election bill, and you will remember, as others do, that John F. Kennedy was going to lose that election to Richard Nixon. Joe Kennedy, the poison patriarch, as I called him in my next book, knew that they were going to lose that election unless they won West Virginia and Illinois. So he recruited through Frank Sinatra some of his mafia buddies, Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, some of those men, Frank Costello, to help them win Illinois and West Virginia. And that's exactly what happened. They did win those states, and JFK was in the White House. But Joe Kennedy had made what I would call a deal with the devil. He basically told Sinatra to tell those guys if they helped them, when Kennedys got in the White House, they would leave those underworld characters alone. Well, I found the key to all of that when I found a witness, John Sigenthaler, a respected journalist and former assistant to Bobby Kennedy, who told me he was right there when Joe Kennedy ordered President Kennedy to appoint Bobby Kennedy Attorney General. And predictably, Bobby Kennedy, who hated those underworld characters, he made fun of them during the McClellan hearings before JFK was elected, he went after those guys. And, I'll tell you a story in just a little bit, because you can't mess around with those guys and double cross them. And what happened is he went after this Carlos Marcello. So I wrote this book called The Poisoned Patriarch about Joe Kennedy, and then I was going to quit, but I could never get those quotes that I had found about Belli, that he knew Dorothy Kilgallen. And one of the quotes when I talked to that doctor that he said to me was, well, listen, about Dorothy, Belli said, they've killed Dorothy, now they'll go after Jack Ruby. They've killed Dorothy, now they'll go after Jack Ruby. Well, this is in 1964, early part of 65 when this happened, and then into 1965 because Dorothy died in November of 1965, as I will explain. Sure. So I wrote that book, and then I started to investigate Dorothy. And I found out about all of her credentials and that she was on the job when JFK was killed because it was personal. She had taken her youngest son, Kerry, to the White House. Pierre Salinger set it up, and JFK had just completely fussed over the little boy, talking about him, giving him a PT 109 pin, talking about the letters he brought from the third grade class. It just meant a lot to Dorothy and to little Kerry. So when JFK was killed, Dorothy Kilgallen said something that in one of her columns that I put in both books, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and the follow-up book, Denial of Justice, which was released last year and gives more of the story I'm telling. So basically what happened is that Dorothy said in one of her columns, the man I remember is a tall man stooping over a little boy, praising him for the letters he brought from the third grade class. This is the man who was assassinated in Dallas. She immediately went to Dallas and covered the Jack Ruby trial. She's the only reporter to have interviewed Jack Ruby during that trial. She did it twice.
Amazing.
His testimony before the Warren Commission,
Twice?
Twice. She released his testimony before the Warren Commission, before it was supposed to be released. She was really on the job, and she wrote all of these columns basically blasting the Oswald alone theory that was being shouted to people by J. Edgar Hoover. Now, I don't want to forget to give people a website. It's called the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. Everything about Dorothy is up there. Photographs, quotes from her, her newspaper columns, interviews with people that knew her, some very important interviews up there. My favorite one, the photographs, is her standing in the middle of the courtroom during the Dr. Sam Shepard case. All the other reporters are gathered around her in respect. Dorothy was the most powerful female voice in America, according to the New York Post. Hemingway called her the greatest female writer in the world. She had the best sources, and she really went after the JFK assassination.
Mark, I think she really went beyond this being a great female journalist and media figure. She was, in the top big leagues with anybody, male or female.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, she was, and we have to know too, as I've talked to college students, she was a college dropout. She overcame all the gender issues there were to become that journalist, with being involved in so many media things, a media icon for sure. So many people have said to me, we wish we had a reporter like Dorothy Kilgallen today with the integrity that she had, because she went after the facts, and that's what she did with the JFK assassination. So I started getting all this new information about Dorothy, and found out that the first thing she did after interviewing Jack Ruby was go to New Orleans. Well, who was there? Well, that was Carlos Marcello, this mafia don's empire stretching into Dallas. And the reason that she went there is because I think she learned from Ruby that there was a connection with Marcello. And you have to remember that Bobby Kennedy was going after these mobsters, and one of the things he did was to deport Carlos Marcello and then charge him with racketeering. So right then, I became different than I believe anybody else in history has been, except for Dorothy. I started looking at why Bobby Kennedy was not killed instead of why JFK was. Why Bobby wasn't killed instead of JFK was because, as Bill Alexander, the prosecutor of Ruby, told me, Bobby had many more enemies. And what I've discovered was what Dorothy discovered through her eyes, that what had Marcello decided? He couldn't continue to let Bobby Kennedy throw him out of the country or put him in prison. So what did he do? He decided, if I kill Bobby Kennedy, who I hate, Jack Kennedy will come after me with everything the government has. But if I kill Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy will be powerless.
Get out of a job.
And Bill, that's exactly what happened. Bobby Kennedy was powerless. He never went after those guys again. Finally, he resigned as Attorney General. So Dorothy had found out all this information. She had gone to New Orleans on a very mysterious trip, because on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, you can find the account of that trip from one of Kilgallen's hairdressers, Mark Sinclair, who said they went there together, and then she called him at the hotel and said, go back to New York City. Don't tell anybody you were here, and don't ask any questions. And then she said to him, if the wrong people know what I know about the JFK assassination, I would be dead. She bought a gun. She knew that she was going to be a target of those people that she was going to expose in a book she was writing for Random House. And as November 1965 came along, Dorothy was in danger. And I covered that very thoroughly in The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, with more information now in Denial of Justice. And then I can lead up to what happened to her on November 8th, 1965.
Good. Well, okay, good. Before you do that, Mark, this is a silly little point, but a lot of people don't know how to spell her last name. Spell her last name so that people can go to the website, Mark, please.
Sure. Dorothy Kilgallen, Kilgallen, Kilgallen. And as I say, if you throw her name into YouTube and mine and JFK and Denial of Justice, Reporter Who Too Much, you'll see all of these videos. But the other thing you can do, and many people around the world that I've heard from are all watching What's My Line now, because all of those videos are up there and you can see them. And some of them are hilarious. The one with Groucho Marx is my favorite. But if you watch it, you're going to see what everybody knew. Dorothy was like a prosecutor. When she went to some of these trials, the defense and prosecution would look at the column that she wrote about that case the next day, and they would use that material in their final arguments. If you look at her columns, the first one after JFK was killed, the Oswald file must not close. She wrote one about Jack Ruby. She wrote all of these columns just blasting the Oswald alone theory and all of that. So you can find plenty of information about Dorothy. And I'm going to be able to tell you in just a few minutes what happened to her. And after she died, she basically disappeared from the face of the earth. So I'm really proud of the fact that people are learning more about Dorothy and what a remarkable woman she was, Bill.
No, it's fantastic. Listen, I want later on, I just want to remind ourselves that you're going to tell us about the case that has been reopened. Don't give away any details yet, Mark.
Sure.
Lead us up to November 1965. She's been to New Orleans. She sent her hairdresser back. She buys a gun. She buys a pistol. Okay. Take us to the tragic happenings of November 1965 with Dorothy Kilgallen.
Well, it's interesting because when I'm talking about these two books now, I'm also keeping in mind the new one I'm writing, which is called Collateral Damage. And basically, it's a book that will connect the deaths of Dorothy Kilgallen, John F. Kennedy, and Marilyn Monroe. Many people have asked me over the last couple years if I would investigate Marilyn Monroe's case, and I pretty much decided not to. I couldn't find enough information until about 6 months ago when I did. And so that's the next book I'm writing. And I will just tell you about, there's so many similarities between Dorothy Kilgallen's death and Marilyn Monroe's. But one of them is that both of them, unfortunately, were blabbermouths. Right before Marilyn Monroe died, just to give away a little bit of what I'm going to have in the new book, she was about to go to the media about her affairs with both President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and some things that she knew that they told her about national security. And unfortunately, she let that be known. In Dorothy Kilgallen's case, she started saying, I'm going to crack the JFK assassination mystery. I'm going to crack that case. Like I said, if the wrong people know what I know, but I'm going to get all the facts. I know there was a plot to kill the president. And one of the things I want to mention right now is the most important documents in history about the JFK assassination. Those are the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. Excerpts from them are in the new book, Denial of Justice. They're on my website, markshawbooks.com, and I found out about them, Bill, and they led me to understand more why Dorothy Kilgallen was in danger. A reader of one of my books, a lawyer down in Fresno, California, called me one day and said, Mark, I'm going to give you a gift. I just read your books, and I want you to know that I have a copy of the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. Well, there were 2,000 pages. It took me almost 3 weeks to go through them, and what I found in there was just shocking. There was evidence from primary source witnesses under oath at the time, talking about Jack Ruby being at the Dallas Morning News offices at the exact time JFK was killed and looking down toward Daley Plaza. There was a witness who overheard a telephone conversation where Ruby said he would be there when Oswald was going to be transferred, which completely destroyed his saying earlier that he just happened to be in the Dallas basement. There's testimony that Dallas Police Department officers helped him get in the basement, and that he made like a reporter to do so. So Dorothy knew all of that because she was in the front row at the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. And I want to say right now too, Dorothy is the most credible reporter to have ever covered the JFK assassination, which put her in danger, because unlike me or anybody else who has ever written about the JFK assassination, Dorothy was there. She was an eyewitness to what's going on. So she had all this information, Bill, and she was going to write this. She was writing this book from Random House. So it was November 8, 1965. Approach. She had a target on her back, and what we know then is that she showed part of the manuscript she was writing to Bennett Cerf, who was on the panel at What's My Line, but also, most important, the publisher, the founder of Random House. And he looked at the material she brought and was very impressed. The next thing she did is she went to P.J. Clark's, which is a famous watering hole in New York City. I sat during my investigation right where she was in that bar. She met with a producer friend of hers at CBS, and then she went to a hotel very near where she lived on East 68th Street. She met what at the time was called a mystery man in a corner booth. And what we know from that point on, they were having a very serious conversation. And a few hours later, Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead in her townhouse bedroom, a bedroom she never slept in, wearing her eyelashes, her false eyelashes, hairpiece, and makeup, in clothes she never wore to bed, with a book upside down on her lap she'd already read, and no reading glasses anywhere. Unfortunately, when the police were not called for several hours, and in between that time and when they were called, FBI agents or rogue agents pretending to be FBI agents stormed into the townhouse and took away all of her documents, her folders, her files, everything, including her JFK assassination investigation file. Finally, the police were called. They came to that townhouse. The detective in charge went into the bedroom, saw an empty bottle of Seconal, which are sleeping pills, and just decided, hey, here's another celebrity who overdosed on drugs, determined in his own mind that it was an overdose of barbiturates. The police agreed because they didn't do any investigation. Case closed, done, over, history, no investigation of any kind whatsoever. Despite the fact that there was obviously a staged death scene there, based on what I told you about where Kilgallen was found. So I took up the investigation of Dorothy's death, and I will just tell you, Reporter Who Knew Too Much is a true crime murder mystery, just as Denial of Justice is, but even more so with A Reporter Who Knew Too Much, because I give you 5 suspects to pick as to who eliminated Dorothy Kilgallen based on motive. And I always was interested in motive because of my years as a criminal defense lawyer. So the first one is Marcello, obviously. Marcello, because he probably, in all likelihood, we know, knew that she was going to write in that new book that he orchestrated JFK's death. We have Frank Sinatra, who she and Frank Sinatra hated each other. They had a lot of ill feelings over some columns that Dorothy wrote about his bimbos and his affiliation with the mafia and all of that. We have J. Edgar Hoover, who she believed had covered up the JFK assassination. We have her husband, Richard. They were estranged at the time, and so he had motive to have gotten rid of her because she was going to change her will. And then there was this mystery man who I identified after proving that Dorothy had been murdered based on there being not 1 barbiturate in her system, but 3, and other forensic science material that showed she had been murdered. So I had this mystery man, and I've identified him as Ron Pataki, who was the journalist who knew Dorothy. So I like to have my books let the reader make up their own mind. Sure. And so they could do that with The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and Denial of Justice. But what was really disturbing to me is that there was no investigation of any kind, and nobody stood up for Dorothy Kilgallen. Not her What's My Line colleagues, not her newspaper colleagues, not her family. Nobody did. Her radio friends, all of these people, nobody stood up for her. Nobody said, hey, wait a minute, Dorothy Kilgallen didn't have a drug problem. She didn't have an alcoholic problem, because the final verdict from the medical examiner was that she died of a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. And then they said circumstances undetermined, which if you think about it, circumstances undetermined doesn't mean accidental death, which is what they promoted to the media. It means that you really don't know what happened. And that's what the verdict should have been, because of all the confusion about what happened. But the media ran with that, just as in Marilyn Monroe's death, when basically the medical examiner came along and decided that there was all these pills there that she supposedly took, rendered a verdict that she had committed suicide, but they used probable suicide, which again means that they didn't really know what happened. So there's a great similarity and a disturbing one between those 2 deaths for sure. And then I can give you an idea at some point about how I tried to get Dorothy Kilgallen's case reinvestigated, as I'm going to try to do with Marilyn Monroe.
Definitely, we have to talk about that. But one thing I want to ask you is, I assume then that when her death occurred, was the manuscript in her possession? Where was the manuscript for her book that she had shown to Bennett Cerf?
Well, unfortunately, we believe it was part of the ones that were confiscated by the FBI or rogue agents posing as FBI agents. And so it disappeared. It's never been found. And that's one of the reasons that I've asked for the reinvestigation that you've talked about. And then I'll explain in a minute. Yes. Sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it all comes together in that she was a brilliant woman, very intelligent, well-read. I'm sure she probably knew at that time that mixing alcohol and sleeping pills was not a good idea, right? I mean, that was pretty much basic knowledge at that time, right?
Yeah, and what happened again is, as I say, nobody stood up for Dorothy. They figured that they knew she was investigating the JFK assassination. So if those same people killed Dorothy. Well, they were all scared, but it's just unfortunate and just alarming that nobody stood up for her at all, because there was no drug problem. I've even found new evidence in that of that for the new book, Collateral Damage. And so, unfortunately, though, her reputation was really tarnished, just as Marilyn's was, because they really didn't look into what had happened. Neither woman received the justice that they were supposed to have, and unfortunately, what this has done is cause all of these distortions of history through the years. People may ask when they watch this interview, why is any of this important, Mark? For God's sakes, it happened nearly 60 years ago. Well, it's about history. And we need to make sure there aren't these distortions of history. And unfortunately, because of the whole cover-up of Dorothy Kilgallen's investigation of the JFK assassination, nobody ever knew about her until recently. And the same thing happened with Marilyn Monroe. So it's all about justice and distortions of justice, and my trying to do my part to get the justice for both of these remarkable women.
Sure. And now, was there supposedly something? There's another factor here that enters into it, and it probably has an impact on the case we've mentioned a couple of times already, that was recently opened or reopened last year. And that is that wasn't the autopsy on Dorothy Kilgallen, if you can call it that, performed in Brooklyn?
Well, that has always been, yes, my first belief about that was that, yes, that was the case. And I think when I first appeared on your show, we talked about that. There's now some confusion there, because we know the body was taken to Brooklyn, but now I've been told, and in fact, one of the people who has clarified this, which I was happy about, was Michael Baden, Dr. Michael Baden, who's the famous forensic scientist who I've interviewed 2 or 3 times, and also Cyril Weck, who's a very interesting man, a forensic scientist as well. Both believe now that the body went to Brooklyn, but it was examined in New York City. Another similarity, by the way, between Kilgallen's death and Dorothy's was that the medical examiner, the big guy, both in LA and New York, weren't the ones who performed the autopsies. They were junior medical examiners who did that. And both of them have admitted they made mistakes. In fact, also the detective who was going to investigate Dorothy Kilgallen's death, I found some firsthand information from him, some primary source information from him. I like to use primary sources when I can. Where he said if he had been told that there was any question about Dorothy Kilgallen's death, instead of it being an accidental death, he would have investigated. And so that's the real unfortunate part of that, because he didn't know about it, and therefore he never did investigate. And whether it's a private citizen and whether they died last week or 5 years ago or 50 years ago, they're a victim of a homicide. If they're a victim of a homicide, they have rights, and both of these women have been denied those rights.
Of course. So for whatever reasons, she dies in Manhattan, which is New York County. At some point, her body is taken to Brooklyn, which is Kings County, which it kind of gets me to scratch my head a little bit. But anyway, some would say, oh, well, the mob controlled the operation in Brooklyn. They had much greater influence, but who knows? So Michael Baden, when he looks at that autopsy, I mean, did he ever express on a scale of 1 to 10 what he thought of it for the autopsy for Dorothy?
Yeah, well, I've appeared on a lot of different shows, and one of them is in New York, and basically they set it up so Baden and I could be on the same program.
Oh, awesome.
And his name was on the autopsy, and he didn't remember that. And so right away, I kind of put him on the defensive when I said, he would have known.
Wait a second, Mark. Wait a second. He would have known. This was not just some Tom, Dick, or Harry, and he had an understudy for a poor guy. A body was found in a park. Was a homeless man. This is a famous person.
Yeah, he expressed surprise. He knew he was there at the time, but he didn't remember, he said, that his name was on the autopsy. Now, as I say, that's a little bit hard to believe. But anyway, we started talking about this, and he was very defensive about it. Because and then I finally interviewed him another time by telephone, and he just didn't want to admit that there were any complications there. And I will tell you, there not only was mafia control in Brooklyn, but in the New York Medical Examiner's office as well, and I have eyewitnesses who were there. So they basically just covered all this up. And, fortunately for them, the police just didn't, do any investigation whatsoever to look into any of this, as the detective says he would have done if he would have known there was a problem, a question mark about her death.
Well, okay. So then Dorothy Kilgallen goes to her grave with a manuscript that had, all the incredible findings.
Right.
I mean, I'm just wondering, after her death, what did Bennett Cerf have to say? The man who saw the manuscript, saw all the incredible revelations, probably knew he had an absolute barn-burning bestseller from her.
Well, he
What
only
did
saw
he say
part
afterwards?
of it. Saw a small part of it. But Bill, they all clammed up. They all were, again, remember this atmosphere that there would have been. They all knew what she had been doing with the JFK assassination, all of her columns, her interviews with Ruby. I mean, they knew she was the most credible reporter looking into this. As Bennett Cerf said, when Dorothy Kilgallen went after a case, she went after it full bore. She had the best sources and everything. Now she's dead. And so all of them, the family, her journalistic friends, her radio friends, everybody just clammed up. And it was the same thing with her What's My Line people, and the same with Bennett Cerf. They were scared silly that if they got into that and they started talking about, he had a part of the manuscript, not all of it. And so he wasn't about to say anything, because you can't mess around with those guys. Let me just give you this quick story, if I may.
Sure.
When I was with Good Morning America, I covered trials and interviews and things. They sent me to Philadelphia, Bill, to interview a lawyer for the mafia don there, Angelo Bruno. I can't remember the lawyer's name, but the mafia don was Angelo Bruno, because there was speculation in the newspapers that the mafia was going to try to take over Atlantic City. And so we were surprised, the producers and everyone, that this lawyer would talk to me. But I went to Philadelphia, sat down with him, just like I am with you, and he gave me information that I really couldn't believe, and the producers couldn't believe that he gave me about this mafia don, Atlantic City, and everything else. And so they sent the tapes back to New York City, and the next morning they played that on the show, and it was just a huge shock to people and a success and all of that. People just amazed at what he had said. And so they called me before I left Philadelphia and said, "Mark, do you think he'll talk to you again?" And I said, "Oh, well, let me find out." So I called his office, and this woman came on with the name, and I said, "Hey, it's Mark Shaw. I was there yesterday." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm wondering whether we might," and she kind of interrupted me, and I could hear her. She was crying. And I said, "Are you okay?" And I just got a chill when I say this, as I always do.
Yeah, sure.
She said, "Well, I guess you don't know, Mr. Shaw. When he started his car this morning, it blew up."
Oh, wow. Oh, my gosh.
You can't mess around with those guys. That's what Joe Kennedy did. That's what Bobby Kennedy did. That's what caused JFK's death. And all of these people that could have come to Dorothy Kilgallen's aid and said, "Hey, she's not that kind of a woman to have overdosed on barbiturates and alcohol," they just shut up, and no investigation occurred, and none of them said anything. Just let me give you an idea how scared those people were. The two hairdressers that were interviewed and are up on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org about Dorothy never came forward until 1999. Joe Tonahill, who was the co-prosecutor of Jack Ruby, finally was interviewed about Dorothy Kilgallen, and you can see that on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org about her interviews with Jack Ruby. He never was interviewed until 1985. Nobody that was involved in that case and had any connection to Dorothy ever wanted to come forward.
Right. So then, now, concerning your own relationship with Belli, I mean, you did speak to him a couple of times about it.
No.
You never had a chance.
No,
You got really
I had plenty of chance, Bill, as I can testify to, and people that I interviewed and all of that. He never talked about the Jack Ruby trial or the JFK assassination, except for those two comments that he made, as far as I know at least, to those two friends of his. His closest friends told me once that subject came up, he would never talk about it.
Right. So, my first impression of the whole thing, I mean, I was just a little kid when John F. Kennedy got killed,
Sure.
was that later I lived in Colombia, South America, and I saw, the after effects of many assassinations.
Of course.
And what I remember is that there were two presidential candidate assassinations that took place in Colombia while I was there. Actually, one was just on the eve of my trip to Colombia in 1989, and that was Luis Carlos Galán, he was the heir apparent. He was going to win the election. Very popular, charismatic, very tough about his plans and what he was going to do to the Medellin cartel that was basically trying to take over Colombia completely. He wanted to extradite them. And so at a campaign stop, security was eased. He got killed. And then there were other assassins whose job was to kill the assassins.
Okay.
And then later the same thing happened again. This was in the case of Carlos Leon Gomez Pizarro, and he was on a plane. Apparently, before it took off, he was shot on the plane, and then his assassin was killed.
Sure.
So to me, I looked at this and said, well, this is just, Murder Incorporated 101 for practitioners,
Yeah. And your logic is exactly like Dorothy Kilgallen's. When she really looked at all of this, and I followed that path too, all of this was just a mafia hit. Here's what you do. Marcelo's in trouble. He's going to be deported or put in prison, and he's got to kill the person who's most responsible for that, Bobby Kennedy, but he can't, so he kills JFK, so Bobby will be powerless. Well, what happens? Lee Harvey Oswald, who I've connected through new evidence now to Marcelo, eyewitness there who saw them both together, and Ruby, what do you do? Well, Oswald gets caught. And so now he's arrested. Now he's a loose end. So what do you do about that? Well, Marcelo's empire stretched to Dallas. Two of his underlings were there. One of them was the very first person who went to visit Jack Ruby after he was arrested. So you have that man go to Ruby, and they work it out so Ruby can get in the Dallas Police Department basement. And what does he do? He kills the loose end, Lee Harvey Oswald. But now what we have is Jack Ruby, a loose cannon. And so what do? You bring Melvin Belli in.
Loose cannon.
Yes, to shut his mouth. At trial, he won't let him testify, and he makes him look crazy. End of story again. You button up all the loose ends that way, and that's what Dorothy believed. And that's the most plausible explanation for what happened. You can look into LBJ and the Russians and the military establishment and the Cubans and all of these others who, yes, had motive to kill JFK. But if you really follow the same journey that Dorothy Kilgallen followed and that I've followed, there's no question that that's the most plausible scenario as to what happened. And I'm pleased to say that, emails from people all over the world and those who have watched the YouTube videos agree and are thankful, basically, for what Dorothy Kilgallen uncovered, because it is the most plausible scenario as to what happened back in 1963.
Now, let me just drill into talk about Jack Ruby for a second. Supposedly, there's so many things that are heard. Who knows if it's true, if it's bogus, if it's just an urban legend, but supposedly, according to some of the chorus girls that work for Jack Ruby, that supposedly some of them had said, now maybe it's not true, but you tell me, you probably know this much better than I would, but that supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald knew Jack Ruby. Is it true that Lee Harvey Oswald knew Jack Ruby?
Well, what you have to be careful with, and I will warn people, watch going to the internet and looking up things. Look for primary sources and all of that. There's so much speculation out there. I don't believe, based on my research and Dorothy's, that there's been absolute proof that Oswald was ever in the Carousel Club where the strippers were with Jack Ruby and all of that. There's no question, that could have happened. I go through back what Dorothy was doing. The reason she went to New Orleans was to connect that up, and I believe she did. and have been able to connect up Oswald and Marcello, and obviously Marcello was connected with Ruby. So I think there's no question about it, circumstantial evidence that appeared. The problem with Jack Ruby, the problem with Lee Harvey Oswald is that there, as Dorothy believed and I do, there were so many dead ends there. He was such a confusing character. People said he was in Mexico at the time. There was a double for playing Oswald. All of the things about the shooting, everything else that way. And so he was a dead end in her opinion. It was Jack Ruby who was the key. And let me tell you what's happened that's disturbing to me
Mark,
as well,
yeah,
so people will know.
Go ahead.
You know, we have these distortions of history. And unfortunately, one of them is at what should be the place to go find out about the JFK assassination, and that's the 6th floor museum at Daley Plaza. I was always skeptical of what was happening there until last year when I found out exactly what is happening there. At one point, if anybody knows about it, it's in the book depository building where allegedly Oswald fired his shots. It's a museum. They promote it as being accurate, as being impartial, that the full story is there, that it's an educational trip for people going through there, students and teachers and everything. Well, frankly, it's anything but. It basically is a shrine to Lee Harvey Oswald, and I prove that because when I gave a talk in November at the Allen Library there near Dallas, a colleague of mine and I went to the museum. And all the exhibits are about Oswald. There's very little about Ruby. All of it, just goes forward and basically looks at the Oswald alone theory in terms of the exhibits, which are 3 or 4 years old. The audio tour they give you, the man who speaks on there speaks about this now with no recent developments, the Ruby trial transcripts, anything about Dorothy Kilgallen, all of that. And I, at one point, attempted to give them as a donation all of my research, Dorothy Kilgallen's research, the Ruby trial transcripts and all of that, offered to speak about them there. They didn't want anything to do with me. And so, unfortunately, we have this perpetuation of, if that's a word, I guess, people perpetuating this crazy Oswald alone theory when most people, just don't believe that could possibly have happened if you use any logic or whatever. And so what I've been trying to do is just warn people, be careful going there. Look at the books I've written and other books that have primary sources in them and all of that, and really do that, especially with those 2 twin characters that are very difficult to pin down, Oswald and Ruby. And if you're going to look into Jack Ruby, then really look at Dorothy Kilgallen's assessment of him, the columns she wrote about him and all of that, because I think those are the most truthful.
Yeah, I want to get to the columns in a second. Now I want to get to what exactly has happened in New York City regarding the reopening of the Dorothy Kilgallen case. Tell us about that. I was shocked when I saw that. Yeah. Tell us about that, Mark.
Well, anytime you are trying to get the government to investigate the government, it is an uphill battle. People said I was crazy to try to get the New York District Attorney's Office to reopen Dorothy's case or open Dorothy's case with an investigation because there wasn't one in 65, 50 some years after it happened. So but I did. I might as well give it a try. So I sent them the reporter who knew too much. I sent them an evidence report of about 30 pages about all the evidence I had, including this fella, Ron Pataki, who I felt was instrumental in Dorothy's death. I gave them everything I had, and then I flew to New York City. And well, first of all, they said that they were going to open it. The New York Post did a big article about it. People were amazed. There were like 1 million views of this announcement, and I was just in ecstasy. She's going to now get the investigation that she deserved in 1965. Justice for Dorothy, So we went through about 8 months. I flew to New York and met with the detective assigned to the case. He was so excited, told me his dad was watching old What's My Line episodes. He was really concerned about this Ron Pataki. He'd looked at all my evidence and all of that, and I left New York I could have walked on a cloud home to San Francisco. So everything was going along fine, and then I was supposed to get an update, and I get this phone call, and the detective is on there along with the deputy district attorney assigned to the case. And I knew right away that there was a problem. And he went right ahead and said to me, Mr. Shaw, you know, we appreciate your interest in this and everything, but we've looked into the case, and we really can't find and we can't prove that Dorothy Kilgallen was murdered. And it's taking so much time and so much money to do this investigation, and so we're terminating it. And as I say, we can't prove that she was murdered. And I just was stunned. And I said, wait a second. I said, there's all this evidence, the forensic evidence from experts other than me, you know, all this toxicology information, all of that. And I kept trying to say, listen, don't do this. And all at once he said, well, listen, I'm not going to argue with you. And besides, we don't know who did it, which completely is inconsistent with the fact, Bill, that they didn't believe she was murdered. That stopped. That was it.
Wow.
They weren't going to do anything else. Well, I didn't give up. I went to the New York Attorney General's office. No response. I went to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, tried to get them to do something. Nothing. Nobody wanted to touch this case. And the reason is obvious. They know that there was government corruption involved, government cover-up, all of that happening when Dorothy Kilgallen died, and with the JFK assassination as well. And as I say, government investigating government is a great uphill obstacle. Well, I haven't completely given up.
Yeah.
Well, it's been about 3 months ago. I don't travel very much, but I was told by a producer on one of the radio shows there that there was going to be a police athletic activities PAL luncheon that the new New York police commissioner was going to be speaking at, and that if I wanted to fly there, he would get me into that luncheon. I had to buy a ticket, but he would get me into that luncheon, and I would be able to meet the police commissioner. And I thought, okay, I've looked up information about him. He seems like a square Joe, and maybe I can get him to look into Dorothy's case.
Wow.
So I flew there, and he gave this speech, and you know, I wasn't going to fly 3,000 miles without trying to get something done. So when there were questions, I raised my hand and I said, you know, Commissioner, I've sent you 3 letters about Dorothy Kilgallen's death, asking you to reinvestigate. What are you going to do with these cold cases like this? I just put it that way. He said, well, Mr. Shaw, Shaw, I got your letters and we've looked at them, and we're going to look into them. I'm not so sure that we can prove this or that, and hem and hawed around and everything.
Yeah,
he said, you know, I don't want to take too much time about this. Come up afterwards and we'll talk about it. So I thought, okay, fine. And it was interesting because before the speech of his, my friend, the producer, was introducing people in the audience, and the New York DA was there, who I wanted to shoot. But there were all these former commissioners and the lieutenant governor and everybody else like that. And then he said, and also we have in the audience best-selling author Mark Shaw. And everybody looked around like, who is this guy?
Love it.
So anyway,
man.
the speech is over, and all of that. I walk up in front, and I walk up to him, and I said, listen, shook his hand. I said, I appreciate your talking to me. And he said, what can we do about this? And he said, come over here to this detective who looked like he could break me in half, and said, Mark, this is Detective Rivera. And I said, well, if I get in contact with him, can I work with him? And he said, sure, no question about it. Looked me right in the eye and told me that. So I, again, was floating on the air as I came back to San Francisco. I sent 3 emails to Rivera. No answer to those. I was just about to send another letter and also call the commissioner when, you know, a much more important event in history happened, and that obviously is the pandemic. So I have left that alone for now. I'm going to wait till things cool down, if they ever do, and then I'll pursue the New York police commissioner to see if I can finally get something done.
Well, so much for those who say that writers just write things and don't do things. I think pretty impressive. You're a man of action, Mark, and good for you. I have to commend you for that.
Well, thank you. Dorothy Kilgallen would do the same thing. I have become a female Dorothy Kilgallen in some ways because I believe she chose me to write her story. She has guided me all the way along. There's a little paranormal part to this. I've been awakened at night at times, and she's kind of guided me along.
Wow.
One night I woke up and I just wanted to I've been trying to find her autopsy report, which had never been published. And the idea came to me to look in the National Archives, and we found it there.
Oh, wow.
I found
Amazing.
documents that I never thought I could find. Yeah.
Mark, that's kind of strange. Why would it be in the National Archive? That was a death of somebody that took place in New York.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is that I couldn't get it from the New York Medical Examiner's Office because I'm not a family member. And so I had this idea. My wife is a librarian at a university out here, and she and I have a friend at the Library of Congress. I got a hold of that friend. She went to the National Archives, and there it was. That happened again about 6 months ago when I'd heard that there was a memo from J. Edgar Hoover to the Warren Commission that I wanted to see about Dorothy Kilgallen not giving up her sources when she exposed Jack Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission. I did the same thing, and this friend of ours went over there and found the damn thing.
Wow.
So it's amazing that way. I think she sent people to me. One of the things I do want to say for sure, two things. One is I'm gonna try to sell a book or two here because I want people, not because it's going to make me some money, but because I want them to read Dorothy Kilgallen's story. Is that the reporter who knew too much? It's been such an amazing success. And Amazon's run out of books for a while. They should be back next week. And Denial of Justice is up there. But what's most interesting is that people who have read the books and also watched broadcasts like yours, which I'm very thankful for again today, Bill.
Sure.
They send me tips.
My pleasure, Mark.
They send me tips. They send me either they knew Dorothy Kilgallen and they're still alive and they knew Dorothy Kilgallen, or they knew somebody who did, or they know something about her, her death. I just received one from a gentleman in Sardinia, Italy, who just wrote me about Melvin Belli. He knew Melvin Belli, and he thinks I'll be interested in some material about him. I get them every day, and I answer every single email that I get, and I take those tips and I follow through on them because they become like my my paralegals or whatever, helping me find the truth about Dorothy Kilgallen, and that's what I'm all about.
Sure. Look, the question I want to ask you is, getting back to New Orleans.
Sure.
Carlos Marcello, Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was born, I think, in New Orleans. Went back to New Orleans a few months prior to the assassination of JFK. So have you been able to determine that, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald and Carlos Marcello and the New Orleans Mafia, did they know each other? Did you say that, has that been established as a fact that they knew each other?
Well, the reason I'm smiling is I'm gonna take the second one first. Carlos Marcello and the Mafia in New Orleans. This woman just got in touch with me. She lives in where does she live? I think in northern part of California. Anyway, she got in touch with me. She watched the video of the Allen Library presentation in November. And Dorothy and Denial of Justice and all of that, and she got in touch with me because she lived in New Orleans during that time, and her father knew Carlos Marcello, and she started telling me about how he created his empire, not in New Orleans to begin with, but in all these little towns outside. And she would give me the name of a mayor in one of the cities who had a betting parlor, or a bar where they, had prostitution and all of this. And so I've been able to piece together exactly how Marcello built that empire, then in New Orleans, and how it stretched to Dallas. The most interesting part, though, of your question is this. Not too long ago, I learned that there was actually a kind of a borderline mafioso at a young age who was an underling to Frank Costello, a mafia don in New York City, the name you're familiar with, ran errands for him and all of that. Well, Costello is the one that set up Marcello in New Orleans with betting parlors. So I learned that this particular gentleman, let me call him John because he really doesn't want his identity known because of some repercussions, especially after I told him my Philadelphia story about the bombing. I probably shouldn't have done that. Anyway, he said that Marcelo at one point said, "I want you to go to New Orleans." This is in November of 1963, about a week before the assassination of JFK. And so
Right.
John went to New Orleans, and Marcelo, he said, had given him an envelope. I'm sorry, Costello asked him to go to New Orleans with an envelope and give it to Marcelo and wait for Marcelo to take it and then tell him something. So John said he went there, flew there, went to this restaurant, I think it's called Marco's or something like that in New Orleans, and I've confirmed that. That's where Marcelo hung out. He walked in the restaurant. He went to the back of the restaurant, and Marcelo, who was a short little broad-shouldered guy, was sitting there, asked who he was, got by the bodyguards, and gave him the envelope. And Marcelo said something to him. He left there, but before he could, on the way out, this tall, gangly white guy, not too old, walked out of the bathroom right in front of John. And he didn't think anything of it. So John then goes back to New York City, tells Costello what Marcelo said, which was, "It is happening." They were so worried about John being either subpoenaed or killed or whatever it might be that they sent him to Europe on a ship and destined for Italy. On the ship, he was watching television when he saw the JFK assassination announcement. You know, the president has been shot, Walter Cronkite, all of that. And what happened then is that basically, the next day or two, whatever it was, he saw on the television that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And he looked at that picture on television and said to himself, "My God, that's the man I saw in Carlos Marcelo's office."
Right. Lee Harvey Oswald being shot on national TV.
Right. He saw that and knew that it was the guy he saw walking out of the bathroom in Marcelo's office. That was the same man that Ruby shot, Lee Harvey Oswald. So you can't get a more primary source, proof of that happening. And, it's amazing that those kind of things come and prove the connection there, as some other things have done recently, to give me an idea as to exactly why Dorothy Kilgallen was in danger, how those people that would have eliminated her found out what she was going to put in her book for Random House, and I can give you that information if you want me to.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's all an incredible story. I would love to see the columns that Dorothy wrote about Jack Ruby.
They're all up there. They're all up there on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. You can read them all.
I got to check that out. My gosh, that's fascinating.
I hope people will too.
A brilliant woman, who died before one would say her time was up, because you never know when your time is up. But she was still fairly young.
52. 52.
Yes. Yeah, sure. That's amazing. So, Mark, this has been, of course, it all begs the question, is this going to be a movie?
Well, dealing with Hollywood land is more difficult than dealing with the government. But we did have interest in, there you go. We did have interest in a motion picture, and we worked with some Hollywood producers for a while. They developed the project. It was taking longer than I wanted it to, and I wanted something to happen. And fortunately, there is a producer in LA, a very well-known producer who produces documentaries. Right. And if you're going to get into a motion picture, it can be years before it ever hits the screen. And
my gosh.
I switched my focus to this a documentary producer, and we have been putting together the parts of the documentary that we need to have, and he is now pitching that to the networks, Netflix, Amazon, the others, and we're hopeful that one of them will decide to go ahead and develop this story, and you're usually looking at only about a year from that happening. So I'm still, that's one of the main things I'm working on. I'm trying to get the sixth floor museum to quit distorting history and give people all of the facts. I'm working on several things at the same time, including this new book. But I believe a documentary will really help a great deal in airing all of the material that we have about Dorothy's death and her life and times.
Well, good. Well, Mark, listen, remember everybody, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, I guess, and just about all the good reads, all the different sites, right?
How about available soon? Because Barnes & Noble, again,
right,
I don't know if you know it. Ebook and audiobook. But let me explain to you, in case you don't know about the book situation.
Yeah.
There is a huge delay in getting books from Amazon. They decided that books aren't really that essential. And so there's a backlog of them stocking books, Barnes & Noble as well, other outlets and everything. People have to be patient. As I said, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much won't be available probably until next week. Denial of Justice is up there. But people need to be patient. But more than that, pretty soon libraries are going to open. And independent bookstores will open, I hope. And that's where you can find used copies of my books. And that's what I would rather you do, is go to the library and get one, or the audio book or whatever. They're not too expensive. And then read the books and make up your own mind about what you think.
Sure, that's fantastic. Well, good. Well, listen, Mark, again, thanks a million. It's great to have you on Quorum Radio, and we hope to have you on again to talk about developments in this case, assuming there are developments after the pandemic clears. God willing, that'll be soon. And we can see if justice is actually done. I think it's fantastic. I applaud your initiative to be able to get this homicide or this death cleared up so that justice is done. And if it was in fact a homicide, that somehow people who were implicated in it, are exposed.
Yes, absolutely. And I take my hat off to you. As you can see, I haven't had a haircut in about a month. But, seriously, Bill.
I don't need one. Mark, you have more hair than I do, my friend.
Well, I do see that. But, Bill, I do want to say hats off to you, and I mean that, because you're one of those people that permit me to come on and talk about all this, about history and distortions of history and everything. You're a good man, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Well, Mark, it's been my pleasure. I've set you up on a number of interviews, and I hope to be able to do so again. I'm hoping to launch a worldwide show very soon, and Mark Shaw is one of the first guests I want to have on that program.
Oh, that's terrific. Thanks again. Terrific.
Thanks so much, Mark. Good having you on Quorum Radio. You have a great day, and thanks for being on. Bye-bye.
Stay safe, Bill. Bye-bye.
See you too.